course, I want to just give you the insight of my experience, kind of give you some heads ups on some things. And today it's AVO. So we're talking AVO today. And so let me turn the lights down and I'll switch to slides. But I'll pass this around first. Conoco was owned by DuPont for 17 years. So 17 of the 20 years I worked for DuPont, we were owned by DuPont. I'm sorry, that I worked for Conoco, we were owned by DuPont. So somewhere in the middle of my career with Conoco, they formed the Environmental Services Division to do work for DuPont that had many environmental problems. And I was the director of Earth Science for that division. We did geology, geophysics, geohydrology, computer mapping, database management, all that stuff. And that division is described here. I'm going into all this, I'll pass around. I go into all that because I'm going to use this front picture as my first story on the slide. So that's where I got the picture. So my career is kind of, let's try that for the lights. Is that okay? Yes. All right, you can still see, okay. So the first slide is the front cover of that brochure, and this is a picture of it here. Sorry, things are kind of blurry, but I'm too lazy to go in constantly at the beck and call of to adjust my settings. It's like, you know, I have a limit. Like, I'm not going to do that. Okay, so not everything is exactly as portrayed. That's the story here. So we did site investigations at DuPont sites all over the country, but we also did some site investigations at Conoco sites, although DuPont had many more vexing problems than Conoco by far. So mostly we did work at DuPont sites, some 36 all over the U.S. But here we are in the Lake Charles refinery, and so we decided we would make a brochure that you put on the front of our picture. You put on the front of our brochure just to describe, you know, what we did. So here's the picture. In fact, we are at the Lake Charles refinery that Conoco has and has today with ConocoPhillips. And in fact, these are two good old boys working the refinery. And this is in fact the cooling pond associated with the refinery. That's where the reality stops. This boat is on the bottom of the cooling pond, and that fish is from the nearby fish market. So what we're trying to show is the unanimity of industry with environmental, you know, and it's typical with anything Photoshop today. We were having a little fun, but that's my lead off, is that not everything you see is exactly as portrayed. Normally, and I'll scratch on the screen a little bit. Normally, this is not the picture you'll see. I'll show you one you'll recognize more so in a minute. But if I have a zone here that is a certain thickness, and I have a velocity such that this velocity here is faster than the velocities on either side of it, then that's going to be a where V1 is bigger than V0, say. That's going to be a positive reflection coefficient. And so when the energy comes down to this boundary, this reflection coefficient, shown here as A, will start back to the surface. And then the energy will continue to propagate on through and hit this other interface. And since it has a negative reflection coefficient, the flip side of that, meaning this guy here, will then start back to the surface. And by the time and now they're both progressing back, this one and this one over here. And this one over here is delayed by two transits through that thickness. All right, so they can't run into each other. They are totally isolated from each other. Okay? However, if this zone gets thinner, and I play that game again to where I send A back, and then later on when that energy has gone through that and comes back, I send the mirror image of A back. Now, as they both head back to the surface, they are in collision and they are superposing and causing an anomaly that hadn't got anything to do with geology. And if that thickness, if that thickness is equal to the velocity times the period over 2, then there's no interference, as per the first slide. And if that thickness, velocity times period, or velocity over frequency divided by 4, if that's the size of it, then you've got the maximum interference known as tuning. And you normally see the slide shown like this. So again, V1, V2, V1, where V2 is bigger than V1. And the SEG convention applies for a zero phase wavelet, shown here. Then this is the positive response from the top of it, shown here. And that's the negative response from the bottom of it, it being this wedge. Now the catch is, the wedge continues to go to nothing. Now when it's over here at nothing, you got no trace. There's no nothing. You don't get any reflection. In between, things happen. This runs into this. So this peak, think of it as a Vibra-sized cloud or wave, a zero phase wave, or whatever. This peak here then runs into the trough, and they then begin to coalesce. And they coalesce and create an anomaly that hadn't got to do with anything other than the container. And it's not trying to illustrate anything about the container. It's just showing you, it's just a tuning thing. Here's the other interesting thing to note, is that if you measure the distance between with a pair of dividers, you take a pair of dividers and measure the distance between the peak and the trough, say here, and continue that process, when you get to the quarter wavelength tuning about here, from there on, that peak trough stays exactly the same width. Even though you're converging, that stays the same. It's kind of an oddity, but that is the case. So, consequently, you get amplitude anomalies that haven't got anything to do with the presence of a container. It doesn't say anything, it's not even a good measure of the container, but it just shows the presence of it. You'll get an amplitude feature that will show up, and then from there on in thinner, you don't even get the right thickness in a situation where, and of course that's the dominant wavelength. You can say, well, I'll just pick a higher frequency. After a while, you've got some dominant wavelength that is causing, in the time domain, this image. And you'll notice beyond the quarter wavelength tuning, the amplitude eventually just dies off, of course, to nothing. There's nothing beyond it. Okay. Now, we normally look at variable area wiggle on Promax. You know, you take the wiggle trace and you add a positive feature to one of the phases. To show no favoritism, and no pun intended, that's you'll often see a dual color representation, and that's one of the options in Promax. You can play back both phases, positive and negative, with two different colors. But in any event, these anomalies can show up as bright features. And if you look at a partial list of hydrocarbon indicators, this might be such a list. A local increase in amplitude would give rise to a bright spot. That could be a local decrease in amplitude. And because, who's to say that the velocity didn't change the other way? The interference could be destructive. And I'll show you some examples of that. So you could have a bright spot, a dim spot, a flat spot. I'll show real examples today of a flat spot, actually taken from real data in the deep Gulf of Mexico, beyond 1,000 feet water depth. Polarity reversals, local phase changes, the whole 9 yards of things that could be a partial list of hydrocarbon indicators. You've seen probably examples of gas chimneys where the P wave data is obscured, and what's happening is the lighter ends of the hydrocarbons, the methane, ethane, propane, is coming out of the formation and screwing up the velocity field. I mean, the velocity field's trying to image that, but it's so messed up with the lighter ends in the pore space that the velocity field is terribly distorted. It's kind of like, well, I mean, best way I can describe it. But a shear wave, as you'll see later, a shear wave who doesn't, and the shear wave doesn't care anything about the fluid in the pore space, can look through that. So one of the pluses on shear waves, the second body wave, is that you can look through gas chimneys in the marine environment with mode converted shear waves. Now, and we'll look at a whole section on shear waves later, but I'm going to do some introduction of some elements of what's to follow today on two fronts. One of them, the use of shear waves, and what's the other one? I can't remember. Oh, the other one, we'll see. The second one there someplace. Okay. Here's a modern example. This is taken from June of last summer from some work by Apache in Australia. This is a dim spot and hydrocarbon polarity, and you can see now this is real data. I mean, so that it's a little rowdy, but you've got a bright spot that's here that ends right about here, and then it picks up again right about here. But in here, the bright spot is pretty well missing, even though they have other evidence to indicate that that blue line is in fact where that anomaly goes. So you've got a loss of bright spot, a phase reversal to the other phase in this two-color presentation, and then back to the bright spot. Now, this doesn't exactly knock my socks off. I just want to show you a modern example. And some of the examples are just this subtle. You can have just this much noise. So if you take away the caption, take away the all the marks on there, and look at that seismic section, you can see just how, what's the right word, underwhelming some of these features are. This could be $1 million issue. And this is not old, this is current. This is Apache talking current data in certain areas. Some places you have spectacular data quality, and some places you've got data that's just this dicey. So, and that's in spite of Apache's effort to display something realistic. Okay, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it's a good time to do it.